comenzar el evento. Muchas gracias. Okay. Muy buenas tardes a todos, les doy la más cordial bienvenida. Soy Irving Rosales, el director del Departamento de Economía, y a nombre de la Universidad Iberoamericana les agradezco a todos el estar aquí. Es un domingo, Día del Padre, entonces el esfuerzo es doble, pero creo que estamos todos seguros de que vale muchísimo la pena. Por cortesía a nuestros invitados, principalmente al doctor Stiglitz y a los miembros del instituto que coorganizaron este evento, las palabras de bienvenida las voy a dar en inglés, entonces espero estén todos bien al respecto. So let me introduce you. I'm Irving Rosales, head of the Department of Economics. Let me present you our guest of honor, Professor Joseph Stiglitz from Columbia University. Jay Pocklington, he's the manager of the Young Scholars Initiative of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to extend to you all a very warm welcome on behalf of the Universidad Iberoamericana, and to say how grateful we are to the Young Scholars Initiative for having the YSI Latin America Convening at Ibero. To our keynote speaker, to all our speakers for the seminar series who have come from different countries, I also extend you a very warm welcome to Mexico. I would like to express my deep appreciation for the invaluable support provided in the preparations of the meeting by many members of Ibero, the members of the Young Scholars Initiative, y la Sociedad de Alumnos de Economía de la Ibero. While I cannot mention each one of you by name here, I hope that they will take this as a personal thank you. Ibero is an institution whose mission is to contribute to the achievement of a more just, solidary, inclusive, productive, and peaceful society through the development and spreading of knowledge and the formation of professionals and researchers with a high human and intellectual quality, committed to the greatest service to others and inspired by authentic human and social values. Given our mission, it is a privilege for the Ibero to host this international seminar of the YSI, home for a new generation of thinkers and a playground to explore new ways of thinking and conceiving economics. I have no doubt that this meeting will be a worthwhile experience for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, it is truly an honor to have Dr. Joseph Stiglitz as the keynote speaker, university professor at Columbia University, recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001 and the John Bates Clark Medal in 1979. Professor Stiglitz will be formally introduced by Jay Pocklington, manager of the Young Scholars Initiative. But before giving Jay the floor, Professor Stiglitz, on behalf of the Universidad Iberoamericana, I would like to take this opportunity to extend our deepest appreciation to you for being here with us today to kindly deliver the keynote address, which I am sure will enable us to gain new and interesting insights. Thank you very much. Finally, I would like to conclude by expressing our sincere gratitude and appreciation to Jay, who made this event possible. Jay, thank you very much. So, Professor Stiglitz, Jay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today.
Me complace estar en la Ibero y en la Ciudad de México. Quiero darles las gracias por recibirnos en su universidad. Gracias por preferirnos en esta tarde de domingo. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a Irving y muchas gracias a Juan Yatsiri for making this possible. Bienvenidos a YSI Latin America Convening 2017. Gracias. I've been practicing this all day to get the 2017 right, but it's 2017. Okay. My name is Jay Pocklington. As Irving mentioned, I'm the manager of Young Scholars Initiative of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. INET was founded in 2009 in response to the global financial crisis. In particular, it was founded in response to the lacking intellectual response that the economics discipline failed to provide intellectually for this crisis. The discipline did not see this crisis coming, and as the crisis was unfolding, it did not provide policymakers with an adequate framework to think through this crisis. We can see this in the central banks had to invent methods and new types of instruments on the fly. There was no guidance from the economics discipline. But this points to a deeper problem, to the tip of the iceberg. This points to a crisis of concepts. This points to a crisis of economic thinking. And this is what INET tries to address. This void that has been left in economic thinking, this is where INET places itself. It supports research that otherwise would not get supported, and research that attempts to go at exactly these Achilles heels of the discipline. And it's within this context that we as the Young Scholars Initiative, those of us who are assembled here today, and those of you who are actually invited to join us in the next 2 days, we've been here since yesterday, and we're going to be here for another 2 days. You're invited to join our seminars if you are interested in exploring these deep-rooted problems. YSI is organized in working groups. Many of our young scholars are working very hard inside specific working groups. And as you were walking in, you could find a sheet of paper that describes some of the working groups which we're working in. For example, represented here today is the Inequality Working Group, the Economics of Innovation Working Group, the Latin America Working Group, as well as the Financial Stability Working Group. In these working groups, and we should appreciate what is happening here, in these working groups, scholars from across the world are meeting on a regular basis, mostly online, and in convenings like these. And we'll get a glimpse in a second how we all mesh together, how we take our responsibility seriously as global critical thinkers that share a common sense of the crisis in economics and how we are responsible as young scholars in responding to this crisis. What this specifically means is that in these working groups, we are tackling some of the conceptual issues within inequality research, within financial stability research. But we also recognize that some of the deep-rooted problems that economics as a whole faces is that we are segmented. We are siloed, we are apart. There's too much expertise about knowing more and more about less and less, and not being in a position to think across multiple frameworks, about thinking across multiple conceptual issues that we're faced with. So what we're trying to do in YSI is to not only be experts within our specific field of research, but also be generalists and train and hone our judgment for us to be serious scholars and global citizens at the same time. What I'm hoping for us to explore right now is, as you see this video, is for you to take seriously this notion that you can be more than simply a simple, small expert. You have your ideas and your curiosity in economics is the energy that we need for us to transform economics going forward, and we are trying to connect you to a global environment, a global community of young scholars that is integrating all these various resources, all these various approaches into hopefully understanding and delivering some conceptual answers to the issues of the 21st century that we're currently faced with. So with that, I would like to ask Irving to show a small video that we've made at our recent YSI plenary in Budapest. Thank you.
Economic inequality.
Money.
Gender.
Uncertainty.
People have a shared feeling that there's a crisis in economic thinking.
We have a kind of attachment to the existing ways of thinking about economics, which needs to be challenged.
So it's a hugely urgent issue now that we come up with the right ideas to explain why these things happen. We have to rely on a lot of the young people to do this because the old ones are often beholden to the old ideas.
Right now, economics is a bit like a kind of established church where nobody is really allowed to think very differently. And like most established churches, they try to get you early and then brainwash you.
Sometimes academia is quite firmly based on certain ideas, certain ideological orientation, but I believe what ISI provides for us to struggle against the establishment.
In order to start thinking about new kinds of paradigms and adapting to change in the future.
To be a good economist, one cannot only be an economist.
It's a project with a lot of heart.
YSI, the Young Scholars Initiative, is a group of young, very, very dedicated people from advanced undergraduates through graduate work who focus on economics from a skeptical perspective.
YSI basically is pretty important for sort of opening people's minds up fast.
I think it's really crucial to have face-to-face communication.
We are a community of global critical thinkers.
We're trying to break intellectual paradigms and build new ones.
It brings the enthusiasm of all of these different graduate students and masters and PhD students together.
And I've been just incredibly impressed by the intellectual energy, the degree of commitment to approaching economic issues.
I also like the diversity in it.
The diversity and the fact that it's super inclusive. Like I'm an example of this.
YSI came into existence rather, how would I say, coincidentally, but it was one of those opportunities you had to seize.
This was an initiative of students from the very beginning.
On one hand, we have to pay very close attention to detail. That's what we're doing in all our working groups. We are working with very in-depth topics, while at the same time not losing track of the big picture.
They found this blend, right, between sort of face-to-face, small, slow, working through carefully, weekly meetings with a crowd that is the same every week so that you can really get into stuff, and then larger and going back and forth. I think you need both.
The number of working groups which represent specific thematic interests has multiplied.
I think there's a good deal of interest in inequality, in injustice, in environmental issues. I do really like the fact that people are going into policy, going into consulting, working with businesses.
Communicating with scholars, learning from them, and also establishing relations with them.
Sharing and hearing will facilitate my future project. And then, most of all, meeting great scholars here is the best thing ever.
These people are setting an example of a community that can stay alive for a very long time.
I mean, academia is not just content, and it's also lasting relationships. This is also, I think, how the world works in a way.
20 years from now, I hope YSI is an enormous organization, a very significant proportion of the population of people who are aspiring to be economists. And there'll be a balance of power that will shift in favor of dynamism and flexibility, all the kind of things economists prescribe for the world when they run their own profession like a polling bureau.
I think this will be a lifelong community.
It seems to me like a great place to get in touch with other people, find support, and get help in doing what you think economics really should be doing in the world.
That's a phrase that maybe gets used too often, but it very good encapsulated YSI. Be the change that you want to see.
I would say that if you want intellectual enrichment and collaboration across the globe with different perspectives on challenging economic paradigms, whether it's inequality, economic development, finance and law, this is the place to be. And we hope to contribute to society.
And that can change the world.
Economic inequality.
Money.
So as you just saw, the Young Scholars Initiative is a peer group. We're coming together to support ourselves in inspiring each other to do better research. We're drawing from the incredible resources that are out there, including our keynote speaker tonight. We're drawing from each other, and we're drawing from experience in the real world, and we're drawing from the deep epistemological grounding that our models are also coming from understanding the history of ideas. The mission of INET and what we're doing in the Young Scholars Initiative is simply to reintegrate economics with the social sciences, with history and the humanities. Only when that's complete do we really have a more healthy and a more sustainable environment in which research can be conducted and in which we can really address the problems that we're faced with today. So if you would like to join this initiative, if you'd like to inspire others with your own ideas and your curiosity, we more than welcome you to sign up into our directory. And this is now me, this is my profile, and I've signed up to all the working groups that we have in YSI, but you might want to choose 2 or 3. And I've also indicated my research interests. So this is my profile, and what is yours? That's the question. We can go look at all the other young scholars. We have 2,400 young scholars currently signed up in the Young Scholars Directory. And we can look if anybody's here from Mexico City. Let's check. Let's do Mexico. Only 27. Is Luis here? Luis, are you here? Okay, I know that Luis is now interested in inequality, Latin America, Keynesian economics, and economic development. And then if you go into the working groups, you can exactly see. If you go to inequality, you can see the working group. They have news, we have general discussion. We have, for the organizers, we have an organizing platform. So you can go and check out the next face-to-face events. Tanya, the organizer, has posted all this news for the working group. So the basic idea, and again, how we organize is, if you want to stay connected to this community, we are doing not only face-to-face meetings like today. This is just the start of us meeting, because we meet in webinars on a very consistent basis across all working groups. In the last year, we had 300 webinars in which we presented the research to each other, in which we invited senior scholars, central bankers, policymakers to discuss with us. And all webinars are open to anybody. So by reading a book and inviting the author to join your working group, and we'll help you make that happen, just like we invited Joseph Stiglitz to come to us tonight. You can provide a public good for others who are also interested in the same things and join these conversations. And you can, like already was mentioned, become an example for others. So if you're interested, sign up to the Young Scholars Directory. It's ysd.ineteconomics.org/register. And you might want to do that now before you forget. But if you forgot, you might want to approach our coordinators. I'm going to ask all our coordinators to stand up right now. They're here in the front. And my colleague Thomas Vass from INET as well. Those are the YSI coordinators. I'm going to introduce you from left to right from my side. This is Guilherme Magacho from Brazil. He's the coordinator of the Keynesian Economics Working Group. To your left is Marcos Reis, also from Brazil. He's the coordinator of the Latin America Working Group. To your right is Miriam Oliveira, also from Brazil, coordinator of the Financial Stability Working Group. And to your right again is Tane Ooms from the Netherlands, coordinator of the Inequality Working Group. And again to the right is Biziana Bala, coordinator of the Economics of Innovation Working Group. And as already mentioned, my colleague Thomas Vass, my co-manager at the Young Scholars Initiative. And now I'd like to actually ask all those who've been presenting over the last couple of days to also stand up in the front rows, to show your faces and maybe make eye contact with somebody that you would like to come to our session tomorrow. You're all invited. We're coming from across Latin America and from across Europe to be here at Ibero, to be here in Mexico City, and we'd love it if you join us in this project. If you want to meet any of these wonderful people at the reception, do that afterwards. But now, as already mentioned, enough advertising. Let's come down to the reason you're really here. And I won't bore you. I won't bore you with the extensive CV the resume that Professor Stiglitz has. I won't bore you with that. You all know that he's a professor at Columbia University. You all know that he pioneered a new research area called economics of information, for which he received the Nobel Prize. Actually, we shouldn't call it that, but the Nobel Memorial Prize in 2001, together with Akerlof and Spence. You all know that he was economic advisor to President Clinton, and you all know that he was the chief economist of the World Bank. I won't bore you with all those details and all the many things he's done. I would like to rather share with you why Haijun Cheng once called him the rebel from within. That's because you might have seen in the video that we have given ourselves a similar title, Rebels Without a Paradigm. We're searching for a paradigm. We're searching for a new type, a new way of doing economics. And I would like to share with you why I find Professor Stiglitz to be an inspiration for our entire community and for all of you here. As I mentioned earlier, we are not just experts, just like Professor Stiglitz is an expert in many different specific research areas in economics. That's not why he is so extraordinary. There are many, many economists that achieve that. He is also somebody who's gained extensive experience in applying himself to the real world, where things are more messy, where you are confronted with different types of questions, where you cannot only have a narrow lens, a narrow type of approach. And that's what policymaking brings with it. That's what somebody who's thrown from an academic field into a policymaking field confronts you with. Your models don't always help you so much. And what he's done is to bridge, in his experience of being in the World Bank and in being in the Clinton administration and being an advisor in many other instances in the real world now, to bridge his function of an academic who's an expert with somebody who is applying himself broadly, addressing the deep underlying problems that we're faced with today. That is something that we urgently need, and this is the type of economist that we're trying to become as young scholars within this initiative. So with that, I hope I haven't bored you too much with this introduction. With that, I would like to invite our keynote speaker for the YSI Latin America convening 2017 to the stage, Professor Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And let me just say, before beginning, a few words about INET, because I was involved in helping create INET in the first place. It was clear that the 2008 financial crisis was a crisis not only in the global economy, but it was also a crisis in economics. Because, as Jay said, it was very clear not only that the economics profession, or to say most of the other economists, had not predicted the crisis, but actually their theory said it couldn't happen. It was, just therefore so clear that there was something fundamentally wrong with that analysis, and yet it wasn't the particular views, the models that were used, many of you know, called DSG models, and I'll talk about them a little bit later, were very entrenched throughout the world, in the Federal Reserve, in the central banks in most countries, in the finance ministries in most countries, and in most graduate schools. So it seemed to some of us that there was a need to try to change, like say, the paradigm, or at least to open up the discussion. Underlying that standard perspective was a belief that was very strong, and in a way it was a very ideological perspective that had very strong political consequence. It was the belief that markets were efficient and stable. And that belief, of course, had all kinds of implications about what was the role of government and what was the role of the private sector. And these are really fundamental questions about the organization of our society. So the models reinforced a particular view of how society should be organized. And if it was the case that those models were wrong and the theories on which they were based were wrong, it would call into question a lot of the assumptions about how we think about the relationship between markets, state, and civil society. So in a way, INET was founded not to give answers, but at least to raise questions and to say that the conventional wisdom had been proven wrong, and this was a really time, should be a good time to re-examine those issues. The 2008 crisis, the failures of macroeconomics were just one example of the issues that the economics profession had not paid much attention to. Another issue that's been mentioned several times in Jay's presentation is inequality. And it should seem obvious to us now that inequality is a major issue in our society. But to give you a perspective on where the conventional wisdom or where the economics profession as a whole stood on these issues, Robert Lucas, and I just mention him because he says things so clearly, if in a provocative way. But so he made two statements, one in his presidential address and one in another article he wrote. The one in his presidential address as president of the American Economic Association was a classic. He said, it was about 2003 or 4, he said, the problem of economic recessions and depressions has been solved. Saying, in fact, that we should never expect to have another economic recession. Well, economists who make those kind of statements often are, those are the kind of statements you shouldn't make as you grow up because you'll be proven wrong. Be much more cautious in what you say. But in another article he wrote, he said, talking about inequality was one of the most pernicious, dangerous activities for economists to engage in. He didn't say it quite as strongly as Mitt Romney, who was the presidential candidate for the Republican Party in 2012, where he said that inequality was the politics of envy and should only be talked about in closed rooms behind in quiet voices. But it's clear that inequality is a major problem in most societies around the world, and in standard courses in economics, there's almost no discussion of inequality. And the standard macroeconomic models are predicated on the assumption that the distribution of income doesn't matter. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So these are, inequality is an example of an important topic that was given short shrift There are many other ones. Climate change is a matter of essential for the survival of our planet, and yet, again, not talked about very extensively. The problem of unemployment. Standard models take the view that markets work well, and therefore there's no such thing as unemployment. I'll come back to that again. So there were a whole set of issues which the economics profession really didn't spend much time on, or said were not problems. They were actually aggressively saying they should not be talked about. And these were problems that are, I believe, at the core of our society. And so that was part of the motivation for the founding of INET. And since then, I think it's done a good job of trying to at least raise attention to the deficiencies, but not only raise attention to the deficiencies, but be constructive in the creation of alternative paradigms. And I'm going to spend this afternoon, talking about one aspect of this. I'm going to focus on macroeconomic fluctuations. And the reason I chose that topic, in part, is because the Great Recession was what gave rise to INET in the first place, but also helps exemplify the problems that I've alluded to already. But I can't help but mention, because of the title of this conference called Globalization in Developing World, some of you may know I wrote a book a few years ago called Globalization and Its Discontents that was concerned about the discontent in the developing world. Well, the striking thing is that, one of the theses of that book was that the trade agreements, the way globalization was governed, the IMF, World Bank, all that was biased against developing countries and against development, or broad-based development. I've found so interesting the debate, say, in the United States in the last couple of years, because particularly under Trump, who's in the United States, there's widespread view that globalization has been unfair to the United States. And it's quite remarkable. He's been making these statements that Nafta was the worst trade deal ever. He forgot that it was a Republican president, George Bush, who drafted and signed Nafta. But he gave the impression that the United States got snookered in these trade negotiations. And I've watched these trade negotiations for 3 decades, and I can tell you the American trade negotiators get almost everything that they wanted. So if there's anything wrong with the trade agreements, it's not because they were snookered, but because they wanted the wrong thing. And of course, Trump will want even more the wrong thing. So this has motivated me to write, I'm coming out with a book in the fall called Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited, talking about not only the discontents in the developing world, but also the discontents in the United States. And how is it that something that was supposed to make everybody better off, there seems to be unanimity that everybody has been made worse off? And the question is, what is the resolution of that puzzle? And that's what I provide an answer. That's just sort of a teaser for you to get my book. Since everybody else seems to be advertising, I thought I couldn't resist. Anyway, to get on to the subject, what I want to talk about is what? What I want to talk about is deep downturns. Deep downturns are different from the mild fluctuations in the economy that occur all the time, inventory cycles. The economy accumulates a little bit too much inventories, and the result of that is that it then faces a period of decumulating and the economy slows down. And then when the inventories get decumulated, the economy recovers and it starts to grow again. Or the other case, many of the economic fluctuations in the United States where the Federal Reserve with its paranoia about inflation gets worried about inflation, steps on the brakes too hard, and then discovers that it just killed the economy. And as it figures that out, it takes the foot off the brake and puts its foot back on the accelerator. But those are relatively short-lived fluctuations. The economy goes down and recovers. But deep downturns happen relatively seldom. But they do happen. And if you look around the world, they happen actually repeatedly. And so the last big one was the 2008 crisis. The Great Depression was another example. And these big fluctuations, these deep downturns, have enormous economic, social consequences, enormous consequences for the lives of the people. When you are thrown out of work and don't get a job again forever, it has a very, very bad effect on your well-being. So those are the kinds of crises that I want to, fluctuations that I want to talk about. Now, many of the advocates of the standard model admit that their models did not predict the 2008 crisis, didn't do very well in telling us what to do about the economic downturn. But their response is, well, those are once in a 75-year floods. That's not our business. We don't know what to say about those things. We're doing ordinary fluctuations. It's like going to a doctor, and if you went to a doctor and he says, I only specialize in colds. If you have anything that's sick, that's another field. And that's what the economics profession basically has said. We don't do deep downturns. We don't do serious economic fluctuations. We only do fluctuations. Our models are good at predicting whether the growth rate is going to be 3.1% or 3.15%. Actually, they don't do very good at that, but that's the test of the model, matching moments and testing it in normal times. But they do miserably at predicting turning points, at predicting big events like this crisis or the many crises that have happened around the world. So the point is the world has been plagued by these episodic deep downturns, and in a way it's striking because this is in spite of the alleged better knowledge of our economic system and a belief, at least among many, that we have put economic fluctuations behind us. I mentioned Bob Lucas's example of this. In fact, I think that those models, including the pre-crisis DSG models, actually contributed to the crisis. And ideas like the Great Moderation, that was a term that Alan Greenspan used because for a number of years we hadn't had a crisis. So he said, oh, I'm a great central bank governor. And people would wrote books called the Maestro, talking about what a genius he was, and he liked that. But that was all before 2008, and where his reputation got somewhat tarnished. Well, this is not just a 100-year flood. And the reason I emphasize this was, I believe the crisis was man-made. When you talk about floods, it's the events of earthquakes, man-made events of climatic change. But this was a crisis that was a result of how we structured our economic system. And if we don't understand how we contributed to creating the crisis, obviously we won't really understand what we need to do both to predict a crisis and to prevent a recurrence. What I'm going to do today is first talk about the basic questions posed by deep downturns, and then I'll talk about three alternative approaches, and I'll try to contrast some of the policy implications of those alternative approaches. And then if I have time, I'll talk about a more specific critique of monetary theory and credit theories that are a particular important part of both the crisis and the resolution. So the three fundamental questions are, what is the source of the perturbation? Is it exogenous or endogenous? And how do economic structures, policies, affect the magnitude and frequencies of these perturbations? The second is, how do we explain the magnitude of the volatility? And here, the fundamental problem is that the changes in the state variables describing the economy, as we conventionally define them, are very small. That is to say, the capital stock, the human capital stock, the natural capital stock, doesn't change very strongly. You know, occasionally you have a war like World War II. That's a big event. But nothing happened in 2008. There was no war that suddenly led to output falling by as much as it did. So there was no change in the state variables in the way we normally describe the economy. And yet, there was an enormous change in economic behavior. Standard economic theory, moreover, argues that the economic system is designed to buffer shocks. So we have shocks, and it's designed to buffer them. So that it's like a shock absorber on a car. A well-designed economic system has shock absorbers. But what happened in our economic system is what seemed to be a relatively little shock. In fact, Ben Bernanke said, it's so little, we don't have to worry about it. This was the head of the Federal Reserve saying, don't worry about it, as the economy was going into a meltdown. Not something that would inspire confidence that he would he knew what was going on. But he was right. A well-designed economic system would have buffers. And yet, what seems to have happened, we're supposed to have buffers, both price adjustments and inventories, but they didn't seem to work. And the third question is, how do we explain persistence? And by that I mean, you have the America's financial sector, for instance, misallocated capital. It did really stupid things like build shoddy homes in the middle of the Nevada desert where nobody wanted to live, and that had consequences. But the resource misallocation was building the shoddy homes in the middle of the Nevada desert. But it turned out that that was a waste of resources of hundreds of billions of dollars, But what we have lost in the decade since the onset of the breaking of the bubble, the housing bubble in 2006, and the beginning of the Lehman moment in 2008, the difference between the GDP that we would have had if we had continued on the course we were, what everybody believed was our potential growth, and our actual growth is in the trillions and trillions of dollars, well over somewhere between $5 and $10 trillion for the United States alone, and a similar amount for Europe. And just for those of you from developing countries, even for a rich country, $5 or $10 trillion is a lot of money. And so there has been enormous cost because of the persistence of this downturn. Now, in my thinking about these issues, one of the, I constantly am looking at two, you might say, paradigms. One of them is the standard competitive equilibrium paradigm, the Arrow-Debreu model, that is the foundations of microeconomics and the foundations of real business cycle. Those theories say that the economy, there's always a full employment competitive equilibrium to the economy. And you waste resources, what does that mean? The capital stock is less than it would otherwise have been. You are a poorer country. But that's no reason why you should have persistent unemployment for over a decade. So something else is going on. So the question is, why is it that these economic downturns, these deep downturns, are so persistent? There's the same real assets, the same physical, human, and natural capital after the crisis as before. And in some ways, we talk about debt, and you'll hear politicians bemoan debt and the problems of debt. But in standard competitive equilibrium theory, debt shouldn't be a problem for the ability of the economy to attain full employment or even for economic growth. Because all debt is who owns the assets of the economy. It's the claims on the assets. It's not even the source of the magnitude of the assets. And again, given the assets, there is a full employment equilibrium. So something is leading, if debt is a problem, there needs to be an explanation of why debt is contributing to this persistence of an economic downturn. So the key question is, what is the source of the persistence? And in my mind, it's clearly not either in the capital stock or in the labor supply. So answering these questions is important to know for knowing the appropriate policy response. To me, an important part of the issue is understanding unemployment, and I'll come back to that several times. In a lot of the representative agent models, and I'll talk about them in a few minutes, there's no distinction between hours worked and unemployment. So if you look again, I don't want to focus too much on Lucas, but he has a book where he talks about using a representative agent model, arguing that the cost of economic fluctuations is not very great. And the reason is, he says, that there's a reduction in hours worked, and it's not that great of a reduction in hours worked. But the problem is the reduction in hours worked is not evenly shared. 5, 10, 15% of the population has a very big reduction in hours worked to the point of unemployment, and others have no reduction in hours worked. And that inequality in hours worked makes a very big difference for their well-being. So one of the central flaws in Lucas's analysis is the use of representative agent, models that don't distinguish between these two issues. And unemployment is real, if there were no such thing as unemployment, it would not have the political salience that it does in our society. It's also important to explain the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of different policies. And I'll come back to that in the end, but I want to just emphasize now is I don't think that the zero lower bound is the key reason that monetary policy is ineffective. We lowered interest rates, say in the United States, from 5% to 0%, and it didn't bring us back to full employment. Why would anybody in their right mind think of breaching the zero barrier and bringing, if you could, the interest rate from 0 to -2, if we could, would make any difference? It would make a little difference, but would it bring us back to unemployment? I think anybody who argues that is nonsense. And you see yet in the standard theory all kinds of complicated arguments trying to say, how do we get the real interest rate down? And they're just focusing, in my mind, on the wrong question. The real question is, the central bank has other tools that it should be using. So, as I said, there are 3 strands of macroeconomic theory that I want to contrast. And maybe I should say at the outset, I'm not going to give a fair assessment. I'm going to be too kind to real business cycle. No, I'm not. I'm going to explain what the 3 strands are: real business cycle theory, new Keynesian theories where the focus is on particularly rigid wages and prices, and a whole set of alternative strands that I think are the right approach. And to be fair, each may have worked to help explain different historical episodes. Interestingly, I think each was motivated in part by an attempt several decades ago to reconcile macro and microeconomics. Back in this, after the development of Keynesian economics, it was very clear in the 60s and early 70s that macroeconomics and microeconomics were very, very different. And students would take micro courses and macro courses, and they were just 2 completely different sets of hypotheses. And that's understandably disturbing. So it was natural that the economics profession wanted to reconcile the 2. There were 2 ways of going about this reconciliation. One was to say, let's make macro like micro. And that was what real business cycle was about. And the other one was to try to say, let's make, there's something that Keynes got right, and maybe we ought to be rethinking microeconomics to make microeconomics consistent with our insights about how the overall economy performs. The interesting thing is that the timing for a real business cycle couldn't have been worse, because it was just at that moment when they adopted that competitive equilibrium theory as the basis of macroeconomics that the foundations of competitive equilibrium theory got totally undermined by the work that I did and Akerlof and Spence on imperfect information, the work that was done in game theory, attacking perfect competition. So there are a whole behavioral economics. So a whole set of strands in microeconomics said that competitive equilibrium model, the Erdogan model, may be a useful benchmark model, but nobody should take it seriously as a model of the economy. But at Chicago, they did. And for the world, it's had a very high price. The world's paid, particularly Latin America, has paid a high price for that mistake. And in some ways, so has much of the rest of the world. In a nutshell, what I just described is where we're going. I'm going to try to describe the real business cycle, which is basically an attempt to bring standard, old-fashioned competitive analysis into macro, a failed theory of macro. The other one is to try to make a macro like to bring into macro the insights of modern micro. And the third, in between the new Keynesian theories with rigid wages and prices, was an attempt to minimize the changes in the standard theory and make it have some ability to explain a little bit of what was going on. So, unfortunately, you probably can't. Oh, you have a much bigger screen in back of me than I can see. Oh, you have. Okay, good. Thank you. Anyway, what I was going to do was, oh, here it is. Okay, was a list of very briefly the key issues, some of which I've already hinted at, and I'll just give you the source of the shock. And in the real business cycle, it was exogenous, and the theories that I think are persuasive are endogenous, whether they're supply or demand shocks, and I think they're not. The more important shocks are demand shocks, not supply shocks. The nature of the rigidities, whether they're nominal or real, and whether they include real rigidities such as cross-sector movement of labor, the role of expectations, whether they're rational or not, the importance of distribution, and we talked a little bit before about inequality, but the standard real business cycle ignores that. Whether firms matter. If you look in the real business cycle, there are no real firms. Whether finance matters. And whether the structure of the financial system matters, whether the economy is always in equilibrium. DSGE models, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, begin with the hypothesis that the economy is always in equilibrium. Well, you're not going to analyze the process of the economy reaching an equilibrium if you begin with the assumption that you are in equilibrium. So essentially, they eliminated a discussion of what should be one of the most important issues. And as I said in the very beginning, stability and efficiency of the economy are key. And if you begin with a model where you've assumed away all the market failures, you get the obvious result: the market is efficient. And if the market is efficient, there's no role for government. So it's not because of deep economic analysis that you come to that conclusion. It's because you assumed it. But then you pretend as if it's a result of deep analysis because you have complicated models that you have to have a PhD to understand. So I basically already described what I describe, what I think of as the real business cycle models, and the important thing is that because markets respond efficiently to exogenous shocks, there is no role for government. Now, there's some really peculiar aspects of these models. One of them is, what is the meaning of a negative supply shock in a macroeconomic model of an industrial economy? In an agricultural economy, a negative supply shock, we understand. It's bad weather. In a industrial economy, in a modern industrial economy, the closest I've been able to find of what is a negative supply shock is a major epidemic of Alzheimer's disease, so that nobody can remember how to produce. So your production possibility schedule shifts down. Your production, you used to know how to produce widgets relatively efficiently, and you wake up in the morning and say, now how did I do that? And we all have moments like that where we can't remember. We had a great idea yesterday and it doesn't seem so great today. But for the whole economy to suddenly forget how to produce is a little weird. But that's the major strand of that is one of the major strands in modern macroeconomics. It's a little incredible, but it is true. Now, another incredible aspect of it, I used to tease, when I give my lecture, I used to make a tease about it, that because all markets are functioning, demand for everything equals the supply, and including the demand equals supply is demand equals supply of labor, which is another way of saying there's no unemployment. Now, you're not going to have a macro model that assumes there's no unemployment give you a lot of insight into fluctuations in unemployment. But then you say, well, what is going on when you see the fluctuations in employment, or this number in unemployment? Well, in that theory, what that unemployment means is that people are enjoying leisure. So the Great Depression, the way we understand the Great Depression was there was a episodic, all of a sudden, people decided that they really wanted to enjoy leisure. And, right now, they would say what's going on in Greece is that 50% of the young people just suddenly decided they wanted to enjoy leisure. And it's remarkable. The only thing that's wrong with this theory is that normally, when people are enjoying leisure, they're happy. But what you see of the young people I see in Greece and Spain and the unemployed people elsewhere in the world is they're deeply, deeply unhappy. They don't believe that this is a real pleasurable experience. Now, as I say, I used to tease and say, that was the implicit assumption. And then I was at a seminar with Ed Prescott, and he said he didn't understand why everybody was so exercised about unemployment, because it was just that they were enjoying more leisure. So he actually seems to believe the real business cycles that he advocates. So that's even more disturbing, you might say. There are also other peculiarities that if the source of the economic fluctuation is a supply shock, you can't explain recessions occurring simultaneously with deflation. So for a whole variety of reasons, I just find it that those theories very unpersuasive. Well, the new Keynesian theories are basically the same, except it was so obvious that these theories can't explain what is going on that economists had to change the model some way. So they asked the question, what was the minimum amount that they could change the model and still get unemployment. And the minimum amount that you need to change the model is to assume some form of wage and price rigidity. They had the most absurd theory explaining wage and price rigidity, which was called menu cost theory. Why is it absurd? Because they said the cost of adjusting prices discourages you from adjusting prices. It was sort of like the cost of reprinting the menu. Of course, if that theory were correct, with the new iPads that all the restaurants have, there's no cost. You don't have to print the menu anymore. You just plug it in and you can multiply all the prices by 1.02 and it'll do it automatically for you. But this was never a serious theory because in fact, the cost of adjusting quantities are an order of magnitude larger than adjusting prices. And if your demand curve shifts over, either you have to adjust prices or quantities. And so they looked at only one side of that story, and if they looked at the other side, it was very clear that you would not get price rigidities. But there are so many things wrong with this theory, the most important of which, given the limited amount of time, is to note that in recent discussions in macroeconomics, the worry is about deflation, not price rigidities. What is the problem? What is the discussion in Japan? They're worrying about deflation. What is the worry about Europe sinking into another pattern of deflation? So if price rigidities were the underlying source of the problem, people would say it's not a source of deflation. It's not. They wouldn't have to worry about it. In fact, if you go back to the Great Depression, prices fell in the Great Depression by 30% or more. Agricultural prices fell, many of the agricultural prices fell by 75%. So there is no way you can argue, and if you look at the data, you can't reconcile the data with this hypothesis of rigid wages and prices as the underlying source of the problem. More advanced aspects of versions of the DSG models have incorporated some financial frictions, have tried to complicate it. But I describe that as Ptolemaic exercises. I don't know how many of you know astronomy, history of astronomy. Well, before the Copernicus revolution, there was an attempt to reconcile what was observed in terms of the movements of the planets, with a theory that put the Earth at the center of the world. And one of the great achievements was Ptolemy, who did a good job by making theories where there were cycles upon epicycles upon epicycles. So he created an unsatisfactory theory by enormous amount of complication. And that's a little bit my view about a lot of modern DSGE. They try to reconcile the facts with the theory when in fact there's an alternative theory that would much more simply accord with the facts. There's one more observation I want to make about the representative agent models, which are at the core of both the real business cycle theories and the DSGE theories. And that is, in representative agent models, it's very hard to have financial markets. Why? Because in a representative agent model, what is a financial market? It's somebody lending to somebody else. But if you have only one person, who is lending to whom? Well, you can't lend to anybody if you're the only person. I mean, it's conceptually just very, very hard. Now, as you know, I've been to make things even more difficult, in a representative, I think, and in some of the theories I'm going to talk about if I have time, asymmetries of information play a very big role. But if you have a representative agent model, it's very hard to get asymmetries of information. The only way that you can get asymmetries of information is if you have acute schizophrenia. So the left side of the brain doesn't know what the right side of the brain is doing, and so you don't know, you don't really know what you're doing. But apart from that, it's very hard to construct models of asymmetric information if there's only one person or if everybody is the same. So that's why I think that one needs to go to what I call these alternative strands of New Keynesian, which are developments in one way or another of Irving Fisher's work, who focus just the opposite of what the New Keynesian models that have become popular. He worried about debt deflation. He worried about prices going down, deflation. So he really anticipated the kinds of worries that were true in Japan, in Europe. But that was because in the Great Depression, the issue was deflation, not price rigidity. Bruce Greenwald and I have, in some of our work, revived and put on theoretical foundations those kinds of ideas. Minsky's work made an important contribution by emphasizing that crises are endogenous and are related to credit. And almost everybody looking at the financial crisis of 2008 would say the financial sector played an important role. So any model in which the financial sector is key, that doesn't make the financial sector important, can't provide a good explanation. So you need to have financial sectors. You have to have lots of irrationalities because they were pervasive throughout the 2008 crisis. There are lots of information asymmetries. Nobody would have lent to Goldman Sachs, engaged with Goldman Sachs if they knew the way Goldman Sachs was cheating everybody. And the same thing's true with most of our other investment banks. Asymmetries of information were just pervasive. These alternative theories focus on, as I say, on deflation, on disequilibrium, on the fact that distribution matters, that finance matters, and in that way they are contrast very markedly with the standard DSG models. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes fairly quickly is to go through some of the key elements here. The first is that the shocks were not an exogenous supply shock. It's not a technology shock. They were created. Nobody thinks of the financial bubble, the breaking the financial bubble, was a matter of technology. We created, our economy created it. It was a result of Greenspan, Bernanke, their mistakes in the policies they made, the way our private financial sector worked. It was created by our economic system. It was not an exogenous shock. And so if you want to understand deep crises, you have to understand these. One aspect of some work that I've been doing with Martin Guzman is fluctuations in expectations of future wealth based on the creation of pseudo-wealth, which is the idea that if you and I engage in a bet, we both can believe that we're going to win if we have differences in expectations. Can't be true if we both have the same expectations, but we wouldn't engage in bets. But a lot of activity in our financial market is people betting. And if you engage in a bet and you think you're both going to win, then you can both feel wealthy. And when you find out that one of the two of you was wrong, your wealth disappears. And when that wealth disappears, you're poorer. And that has macroeconomic consequences. So this gives rise to a demand shock, and that demand shock is consistent with what we've observed. The second thing is it's not just nominal rigidities, but real rigidities, and there are many different kinds of these real rigidities. One of them are based on efficiency wage theories, but another one has to do with adjustment mechanisms, real-world decentralized adjustment processes, where in a decentralized economy, wages adjust to shortages in labor market or surpluses and prices in product market, and real wages reflect the balance of the two, and there is no particular reason that those separate adjustment processes in labor and product markets lead to rapid changes in real wages that restore the economy to equilibrium. There's another source of real rigidities that I think has not gotten sufficient attention, which is really important in episodes of major structural transformation, which entail labor moving from one sector to another. So 75 years ago, we had major increases in the productivity in agriculture. It used to be that 70% more of labor was engaged in agriculture to produce the goods, to produce the food that we need to consume, to survive. But then we had increases in productivity to today. About 3% of the labor force in an advanced country like the United States can produce more food than even an obese society can consume. So you had to move labor out of agriculture into someplace else. And that adjustment process is not a smooth one, because the people who have to move suddenly find that their human capital is destroyed, and often a lot of their financial capital. They own homes, they own land in the agricultural sector, and it's worth less than it used to be. So all of this means that, and today we're going through a similar process, moving from manufacturing to a service sector economy. It takes capital to move out of the old sectors into the new. Imperfections in credit markets mean that capital isn't available, and that results in a real rigidity which can get the economy trapped into a low-level equilibrium. Still, another aspect where this theory differs from the theories that I described before is that I mentioned deflation can be a source of problems. And what I wanted to emphasize here is the nature of the market failure, because I began by saying the standard competitive theory argued that there was always a full employment equilibrium. You might waste capital, and so your level of productivity is lower, but you might have more debt, and that would mean that some people have claims to goods than others, but there's always a full employment equilibrium. And so the question then is, what is the market failure that results in the economy not being in that full employment equilibrium? And the old-fashioned new Keynesian models with assumption of rigid wages and prices gave a very simple answer. Because to get full employment, you had to have flexible wages and prices. Wages and prices had to adjust to make sure that demand was equal to supply. And so they had a very simple hypothesis. What was the market failure? Wage and price rigidities. That was the market failure. But when you have wages and prices falling at the rate of 10% a year, as they were in the Great Depression, or you worry about deflation, then that's not a persuasive answer to the question. What this strand of macro says, the market failure is an incomplete set of contracts. And the imperfect indexing of contracts is what distinguishes the Error-Debreu model in particular from these macroeconomic models. Why are these important? Why does deflation have a consequence? Well, because deflation, there are two things going on. What happens when there's deflation, there's redistributions from debtors to creditors. What debtors owe is worth more, and that means there is an increase in inequality, and that means the decrease in aggregate demand. And the economy adjusts slowly to that demand shock. So deflation worsens the problem of aggregate demand because distribution matters and it has real effects on ownership claims. It also matters because firms matter. When firms have borrowed money in unindexed contracts, if prices go down, what they owe is worth more. And therefore, their balance sheet, their net worth goes down. And because of imperfections in capital markets, equity and credit rationing, the effects of that cannot be instantaneously undone. So what this says is the way you have to understand the difference between the Error-Debreu model and the macroeconomy as it really is a whole set of market failures having to do with imperfect information and imperfections of contracting that interact in ways that lead to significant decreases in aggregate demand. The same thing is true about the adjustments in wage and prices that occur is that the banks have been unwilling to lend, and borrowers, in many cases, unwilling to borrow. But it has nothing. The central problem is not to do with the zero lower bound. One more point I wanted to mention, which is an example. A number of times during this lecture, I've mentioned things that you could only understand by going outside a model, a macro model with a single sector. You can't have issues of moving from agriculture to manufacturing, manufacturing to a service sector in a model with a single sector. So sometimes the simplest model to understand what is going on has to have at least two sectors. And that's an important point because macroeconomists don't like to have more than one sector. But there's one more implication of that. Monetary policy is non-distortionary if you have only one sector, but if you have two sectors, it can have distortions in the relative resource allocations to the two sectors because it uses adjustments in the interest-sensitive sector as the mechanism for equilibrating the macroeconomy. So the second set of ideas has to do with fiscal policy. While the theories that I just described, the alternative models, predicted that monetary policy would not work, but not on the basis of the zero lower bound, on the basis of an understanding of how the credit and financial system works. They argued that fiscal policy would work, that there can be large multipliers. Now, a number of times I've given talks on this, and I was at the World Bank and somebody raised their hand and said, the evidence is that multipliers, looking at, say, fiscal government multipliers, are typically small. And then I asked, what is that evidence? And the evidence is the following. If you look at the economy when it's at full employment, increasing government expenditure doesn't increase GDP. Well, big surprise. If the economy is at full employment, you don't expect the economy to expand because it's at full employment. But that's not the issue that we are interested in. What we want to know is when we have a deep downturn like the 2008 crisis, will there be a significant multiplier? And in fact, it's very easy to construct models within that framework that I talked about, where there is a crowding in of investment, a crowding in of consumption, and large balanced budget multipliers. And the third area that has gotten a little bit, is not talked about a lot, but should have gotten more discussion, is debt policy. In 2008, it was very clear that many American households, and this is true in other countries as well, were very over-indebted. Well, there was an easy solution to the problem of over-indebtedness, and that was writing down the debts. Now, there used to be a couple of ways of writing down the debts that were more civilized. You could have inflation, and if your debts were not indexed, then the real value of the debt would go down, and in a few years, if you had enough inflation, the debt would have been largely written off. But given the view that is widespread today with no very strong evidence, but it's become part of the religion, inflation is a bad thing. No central bank says, I want to have a 10% inflation rate. So you're not allowed to, and it's very hard in conventional monetary policy to get inflation up. So inflation is not going to be able to get rid of it. So you have to do it in other ways. And there were other ways in which you could have done it. One is a debt restructuring, what I call a homeowner's Chapter 11. A few countries did this, something along, Iceland did it, and partly because Iceland did it, it had a quicker recovery, even though it was one of the deepest and downturns of any country. Unfortunately, not surprising, there was resistance from the banks supported by the Obama administration. So let me finally just conclude with, so the crisis in economics, the criticism is not just that the models did not anticipate the crisis, it was that they did not contemplate the possibility of a crisis, said it wouldn't happen, had no insights into what generated it. And not surprisingly, they have not provided good guidance on how to respond. So it's 10 years after the crisis, and still employment output, the employment ratio is not back to normal in the United States. In Europe, youth unemployment is still extraordinarily high. And I don't think, it's very clear that the cost of the crisis has been unnecessarily high precisely because of the economic models didn't work. There are alternative models, and I try to illustrate some of those, arguing that these provide better insights into the functioning of the macroeconomy. They are actually more consistent with micro behavior, not with the simplistic micro behavior assuming perfect information, perfect markets, perfectly rational behavior, but with actual micro behavior as it's observed, and more consistent with what has happened in this and other deep downturns. I think these alternative models, as I've just said, provide alternative insights into what kinds of macroeconomic policies would restore the economy to prosperity and maintain macro stability. And what I've tried to do is illustrate, to sketch some elements of these alternative approaches. Let me finally end on a very positive note. The ingredients in these models, like the models of the banking economy, the banking sector, are actually pretty well developed. Models are of financial interlinkages, macroeconomic externalities. All of these areas, there have actually been very significant advances. So in many ways, the ingredients to the construction of a better model, the parts have actually, a lot of them have been done. So the real challenge is building, integrating these together, and testing some of these models against the data provided by the deep downturns, which unfortunately remain all too prevalent. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz, for your speaking.
So Irving and I will moderate the Q&A. We have about 20 minutes. But before you get all too excited, there is one little game, if Professor Stiglitz agrees with us, that I would like to play at the very end of the Q&A. And that is Stiglitz searches for the representative young scholar. Keep that in mind. You all have to agree now to participate. If there's any objection, you can opt out now, but you all have to participate in the game. Is there anybody who opts out who can stand up? Okay, everybody participates. Okay, we start with questions. We're going to line up we have 3 microphones here in the front. I'm going to ask our YSI coordinator, Marcos Hayes, and Guilherme, and perhaps Tane, or you figure it out, to take... make 3 lines, and you can all come up to the, come to the side.
La idea siendo, sí, se van a colocar 3 personas ayudándonos para la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Y la idea es, por ejemplo, aquellos que estén en la sección del medio y que quieran preguntar, se acercaran con la persona que esté en medio para que tiene el micrófono para que ahí pregunte, y hay otras 2 personas en la parte de las orillas. Entonces, a todos aquellos que quieran preguntar pueden irse acercando poco a poco para hacer las preguntas.
Oh, yes. Should we start? The questions?
Thank you very much, Professor. You said in the beginning that Trump may want more of the wrong things. Just coming back to the topic of the event, do you think that Latin America, and more specifically Brazil and Argentina, have been repeating in the last 2 or 3 years more of the wrong things that went bad in the past? What should we avoid now in terms of economic policy? Thank you. I'm Ana, I'm from Brazil.
Let's collect more.
Oh, okay. So I suppose we're starting with that. I'm Emil, I'm from the Dominican Republic. Just a quick comment before my question. I actually go to Colombia, and I was taught menu policy like it was gospel, so that's very interesting to hear on your end, just the variability of that. But, okay. So they say a broken clock is right twice a day, and that infinite monkeys could write the works of Shakespeare on infinite typewriters. So in terms of Trump, in the sort of new world order that we've got going on with Theresa May and Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron and everything, is there any sort of, it's sort of the inverse of her question, really. Is there anywhere where you sort of say you may feel hopeful that a broken clock might get right in some of these policies that you say are needed?
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Alberto. I'm a former student here at Ibero from International Relations. My question is, based on your studies and your writing on Social Security, how can Social Security help our societies with the new labor markets where automatization is now happening and leaving the workforce out in the new markets here? Your opinion about this Social Security?
Thank you, Professor. This is Ana Cecilia. I'm from Mexico. I work in financial services and risk management, specifically in credit risk management. Thank you for your presentation. It was amazing. I have a question. You talk about these alternative models and everything, but I'm quite concerned about the next big downturn. You know, being risk management is always a concern. I have to analyze banks. I have to analyze many companies in many sectors, oil and gas and everything, industry and everything. So I'm looking always for that kind of bubbles and the things that might arise like the 2008. So I know it's very difficult to talk about what should be coming, but any insight would be very useful. Thank you.
It's okay. Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Stiglitz. I'm René, I'm from Mexico, I studied here, and I work at the central bank. So for me, it's really important to know how we should address severe economic downturns in developing countries. Because in your talk, you talked about deflation normally being followed by a severe economic downturn. But in developing countries, we tend to see an increase in inflation rather than deflation when severe economic downturns happen. So does a more general economic theory of severe downturns address this? And if that is the case, what could be a better policy response, in particular from governments and central banks?
My name is Maria Fernanda Jimenez. I'm from Mexico. I had studied actuarial science and then a master's degree in economy. I think that a very useful tool for real understand the business cycles is the risk management policies that have been developed and are developing right now. And I would like to ask you if you have any analysis about the new ISO 31000 or the improvements of the COSO standard, because I represent Mexico in the International Committee 262, and they are very hopeful about that tool that began to develop it because of the financial crisis. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Luz Martinez Solá. I'm from Argentina. I'm part of YSI. And I would like to know, so you mentioned that, of course, monetary policy is largely ineffective and that there are other elements that central bank could use. I would like to know what other policies are there, because I'm from Argentina, as I said before, and in 2012, the central bank enlarged its mandate to tackle also development goals and not only financial stability goals. And in this, it compelled the private banks to lend 5% of their deposits at a cap interest rate. And I'm wondering what's your opinion on these kind of policies. Thank you.
So, I think, one more?
We'll have a second round. Let's first respond to the first round of questions.
Okay. Okay, I won't be able to respond to all of them, but let me all very good questions. Let me begin with maybe the last question, because it's actually a very concrete one. Central bank policies, as they've traditionally been formulated, focus on interest rates. And one of my criticisms is that that's only one of the tools that are at the disposal of central banks. So another set of tools that affect the flow of credits are a whole set of macroprudential regulations, capital adequacy requirements, a whole set of quantitative tools at the macro level. There are a second set of tools which are to relate to the allocation of credit. And it's always been presumed, or not always, in recent years it's been presumed that government shouldn't get involved in credit allocation. The market does a better job of doing that, and government shouldn't intervene. But anybody who thought about what happened in 2008, it was very clear the market does a terrible job in allocating credit. No government has wasted money in the scale that the U.S. private banking system wasted money. It was an achievement, you might say. But simply from a macro point of view, you might say they should have thought about things like restricting the allocation of credit to real estate, especially in the presence of a real estate bubble. In fact, in the United States in 1994, the Federal Reserve was given the ability to engage in that kind of regulation. It chose not only not to do it, but when it did act, it acted in a perverse way. As the bubble grew, it decided to change the regulations to feed the bubble even more. It was, basically because they say, oh, well, the market will take care of it. And it did, eventually, after $1 trillion government bailout. But even in the United States also, our banks are required, have mandates, what we call CRA requirements, Community Reinvestment Act requirements, that we require the banks to lend a certain fraction of their portfolio to underserved parts of the community. So we do have not only a stability goal, we have you might say, a distribution goal, but it's in a very weak form. And finally, I think developing countries ought to have a development perspective. There ought to be allocation. There are some kinds, creating a real estate bubble doesn't lead to more economic growth. Investing in certain kinds of activities can lead to more economic growth. So it's not that one needs to do the judgment at a very, very micro level, but you can say broadly, in our society, we think that industrial investment yields high returns, or broad sectors have high returns. Lending policy can be a very important element of industrial policies. Finally, two more points on this. Central banks now have a mandate that goes beyond inflation. In the United States, it has inflation, growth, unemployment, and financial stability. And Janet Yellen has talked about the importance of, or the effects of, of central bank policy on inequality. And I've written and shown, that the way it's been conducted has had a very significant effect on the increase in wealth inequality. There are other policies which could have mitigated that. For instance, by paying more attention to access to credit, it could have mitigated some of the aspects of the adverse aspects. And again, within the Federal Reserve, there is a division that works on this. Maybe not perfectly, but at least it's recognized as an objective of Federal Reserve policy. There were two questions about risk management. I just very quickly say one of the excessive. We've learned a lot about the explanations for the excessively risky behavior that led to the crisis of 2008. The first is that the models that the banks used were terrible, even though they were very proud about how sophisticated the models were. And that's important. Part of the reason for that was they used 20 years of data, but you couldn't really understand what was going on unless you used 50 years of data. You don't have crises every day, and if you use too short of a span, you're going to misestimate what is going on. So the models were bad. The second thing is the incentive structures were bad. Alan Greenspan, when he had to give testimony to Congress, said there was a big flaw in his analysis, that he thought that the banks would have an incentive to manage their risk better. But if he had spent 1 minute, 5 minutes looking at the incentive structures inside the banks, he would have realized that they had incentives to act in an excessively risky way. So we have incentive structures that actually induce excessive risk-taking, both at the individual level and at the organization and the firm level. So incentives are important. Third, behavioral economics is really important. There's lots of evidence that the alpha males that dominate in Wall Street undertook very bad, aggressive bets. And they win sometimes, but on average, they expose the economy to an enormous amount of risk. And the INET sponsored an interesting conference about women in finance, one of the themes of which was that actually there was much more rationality on the part of women than on the part of the alpha males that dominated in the financial sector. There's a question about Social Security, if I understand what you mean, the public retirement insurance. I think the major burden of retirement programs should be done through public retirement programs. And there are several reasons for this. First, the private sector specializes in exploiting people who are not financially sophisticated. And the result of this is that the retirement income, the Wall Street wants to maximize its transaction costs. And from a society point of view, we want to minimize transaction costs. So we did a study when looking at what happened when UK privatized partially Social Security. And for that partially privatized Social Security, the net effect was to reduce retiree benefits by 40% as a result of privatization. So it is a this is not a marginal thing. This is a very big thing. Also, private insurance retirement programs do not have protection against the kinds of risks that public programs, like inflation risk. So to me, I think it's very important to have public programs, and there are some very successful programs. In the United States is an example. Low transaction costs, and it's actually done a very effective job in reducing poverty. There's one interesting question of anything to make me hopeful in this global landscape, and there is something. I'm at least hopeful about Macron in France. And the reason why I say that is what he has said repeatedly on the campaign trail is that France needs more flexible labor markets, but if you're going to get that more flexible labor market, there has to be social protection. So he's been talking about creating a Nordic-style welfare state for France. So in other words, if you have what in Denmark they call flex security, ways of protecting people, then they're more likely to accept the greater flexibility in contracts. The problems of severe downturns in developing countries are in some ways different, in some ways similar to developed countries. Malaysia was a developing, middle-income country, emerging market, that had, 1997, 98, a very severe economic downturn. And it responded in a way that was very different from the way that the IMF policies, what it did is it imposed capital controls temporarily. Now the IMF supports that kind of policy. It engaged in fiscal stimulation to help recover the economy. It did some debt restructuring. So the general point is that a lot of the principles that I've talked about still apply. There's a little bit more complexity because typically emerging markets are small open economies. And so they don't have the ability to borrow in the way that the US does. And that is a major challenge, the constraints on borrowing. But there are instruments, even apart from that, that one can use that can, I think, at least mitigate the severe downturn. I was going to say the best answer to a severe downturn is to avoid having one. That's why a lot of what I talked about is, what kind of policies might, the crises are endogenous and a result of policies. And then there was a very broad set of questions of, is Brazil and Argentina doing the right thing or the wrong thing? And, something's right, something's wrong. Argentina and Brazil, over the last, not in the most, over a period of a number of years, were very successful in reducing inequality and poverty. And that was an important part of their program. On the other hand, one of the problems with Brazil is it was a resource-rich country that didn't diversify the economy as much as it should have. And when the price of natural resources went down, it had a very severe adverse effect. Well, I can see that you're anxious to go on to the next set of questions.
Si quieren, ya estamos llegando a la hora y para respetar un poco el horario que habíamos quedado con el profesor Stiglitz, las personas que ahorita ya están levantadas en la línea para preguntar, son 7 personas, si quieren que sea la segunda y última ronda de preguntas, muchas gracias.
Hi everybody, my name is Gerardo. I'm from Puebla, from Ibero Puebla. Nice to meet you, it's a pleasure to meet you. I have the privilege to ask you this. What do you think about President Trump on his period of time, his presidential time? We've been taught in the universities about the globalization and we depend from each other and there is nobody, no country that is going to be such a thing that is going to be independent. I just wanted to know if we have to prepare as a nation or as a country for another downturn from the US economy due to Trump's decision, because what he's doing is this. First of all, he's bringing all the factories, is what he's saying. He's going to bring all the factories to the United States to produce locally, knowing that he's going to pay more on wages, on salaries, on union dues, and et cetera, et cetera. Do we have to prepare for another downturn from the United States? Or do we have to close our borders? What do we have to do?
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. My name is Yatsiri Cepeda. I work at the Laboratory for Social and Economic Innovation at Ibero Puebla. My question is regarding the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's likely that under President Trump's administration, Nafta will be renegotiated. So in your view, which are the key points that the government of Mexico should take into consideration to come up with a fairer deal? I'm particularly interested on the agricultural sector. As you know, small corn producers were badly hit. Mexican small producers were badly hit. So what are the provisions that the Mexican government could take? Thank you.
Hello, Professor Stiglitz. My name is Marisol from Social and Economic Innovation Laboratory in Ibero Puebla, too, as Yatsiri. And I would like to know, well, I believe, I'm not an economist, but I'm really concerned about this. I believe we are social and economical beings, it's in our nature. So I would like to think, if you think that economical crisis has to do with social crisis too. And a second question, would you say social and solidary economy, including different banking dynamics, could help to restore the economy to prosperity and also to maintain macro stability?
Hi, my name is Heidi Smith. I'm the coordinator of public policy here, and I teach political economy. My question is, I study the bond market here in Mexico, and I'm curious if the United States has really hit its bottom. I mean, we have 10 years of continuation. My question is, when we look at our subnational debt in the United States, we don't aggregate it like we would in Brazil or Argentina, but we look at aggregated yield curves. So do the United States have potential debt that we're not calculating, and is there potential for a larger boom in the future?
Hello, Professor. My name is Carlos. It's an honor. I am part of the Mexican Council of Foreign Affairs, and we worked on a research on a possible sustainable project for Latin America. However, all we found is that everything is set on structural problems here. So considering the economic restructurations you were talking about, Latin America went through a way faster transformation in its economies, thus fostering inequality. What would be your recommendation for the region in order to revert these deep inequalities? Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Stiglitz. My name is Ricardo, and I'm an economics student. And I would like to ask you, what do you think about Japan's biggest bank had a year of negative interest rates? Do you think it's something that can be held for long and help them move the lending rate in a deep crisis scenario?
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. My name is Alejandro. I'm a former student, international relations student here in Universidad Iberoamericana. And I was very interested in something you said about labor displacement when agricultural productivity raised. And I'm wondering about the effects on inequality with a long-term automatization, the process of automatization in Japan and the United States, etc.
Sure. Okay. So there were a couple questions about Trump and U.S. policy. Maybe I should make, Trump doesn't have an economic policy. He sort of has some inchoate feelings about certain things, and fortunately, his ability to do anything is very limited. I mean, both his to formulate policies, but he has to get it through Congress. So when it comes to issues like tax reform, expenditures, and I'll come back to trade policy, the president has some powers, but they are circumscribed. So, for instance, when he talked about a major infrastructure program, and the country clearly needs it, but there's not even a sketch of a program, and the contradiction between he says he wants to increase expenditures, lower taxes, and lower the deficits, and there's some arithmetic problems here that people have been trying to explain to him but haven't gotten through. But there are also some political problems, because if he increases expenditures and cuts taxes, the deficits increase, and the deficit hawks in the Republican Party get upset. So even within his own party, he can't get, they're divided, with some people willing to look the other way as long as it's a big enough tax cut for the very rich. They don't mind a deficit, but there are a few Republicans who have a little principle, and they say, oh, we argued against deficits before, we have to still be against deficits now. So politically, it's not been possible for him to come forward with any economic program. We don't even have a real budget for the coming year. Normally in February, the government puts forward, the administration puts forward a 1,000-page document laying out what taxes and expenditure and how it adds up and all that. And he laid out a couple, a short document, I think it was 60 pages, basically saying, well, this is what I'd like, and, maybe we can raise these taxes. And it was not a tax proposal, it was not an expenditure proposal, it wasn't a coherent proposal. So, is it likely that the U.S. will go into an economic downturn? I think probably not. And the reason is that the net macroeconomic effects of his policy are probably basically stimulative. That is to say, cutting taxes and raising expenditures. They'll be constrained, but on average they'll be stimulative. The Federal Reserve is worried about an overheated economy, and so they are more likely to continue to raise interest rates, particularly if he continues to have more aggressive expenditure or tax policies. And as often been the case, there is a chance that they will be overly worried about inflation, step on the brakes too hard, and the economy will slow down. On the issue about whether he will bring jobs back to the United States, there is no evidence. There are some dramatic moments where he shows that he brought back 75 jobs when the same company, the same month, reduced jobs by a couple thousand. So he's very good. Basically, those who are dealing with Trump have learned what you need is a photo op and some new jobs being created, but meanwhile you can go and destroy quietly many more jobs. So you can't think of anything about this bringing jobs back or anything as a real policy. Now, there are some people, but I haven't found it persuasive. There are some people who say, these are chartists, who say we haven't had an economic downturn since 2008. And since on average we have an economic downturn every 6 years, we're overdue. But I don't find that kind of argument very persuasive, but there are some people who believe in that kind of periodicity very strongly. On the area of NAFTA, though, what should be renegotiated? For me, the worst aspect as an American, or the worst aspect of NAFTA is Chapter 11, which is the investment agreement, which curtails environmental policies. It's been used repeatedly against Canada, reused occasionally against Mexico. So far not against the United States, but it's a legal framework which is terrible. So at the top of my list of reforms is Chapter 11 of NAFTA. If I were Mexican, obviously, the treatment of agriculture is terrible. I mean, that we get to keep our agricultural subsidies, which mean that your corn farmers have to compete with our subsidized corn farmers, the effect of which has been to decrease the acreage in agriculture in Mexico, in corn in agriculture, and increase that in the United States. I mean, it's a clear, strong market distortion. But I'm not sure from politics I would do that. From what I've heard, Trump wanted to walk out of NAFTA, but was told by the agricultural states, all of whom are Republicans, that it will be a disaster if he does that. And Mexico's made it very clear that there are other places where it could buy corn. So there are, but from a principle point of view, the treatment of the agricultural sector is very very disturbing. There are one has to, when one thinks about NAFTA, I think there's there's too much worry about what would happen if NAFTA weren't renewed because of the following. First of all, there's at least some belief that even if the United States exited NAFTA, what we call the implementing legislation, which is the legislation which specifies the tariffs, remains in place. So even if we weren't in NAFTA, our tariffs against Mexico would remain zero. It would take an act of Congress to repeal them, and since the Republican Party has been the free trade party, it's unlikely that they would go against all of their business interests and their historical position on free trade, and support a repeal of a raising of the tariffs. But even if they did that, what goes into effect are WTO tariffs, and WTO tariffs are only like 2.5%. They're not significant. The changes in exchange rate more than wash out those. Now there are some problems on what you call non-tariff barriers that are significant. So I don't want to underestimate the importance of maintaining NAFTA. So it is important, but it's also the case there's some hyperbole. But I think the basic thing is, given the cost to the United States, and particularly to Republican states, the likelihood of the U.S. leaving is very low. So this goes back to the general perspective of you need some good photo ops of good American corn being bought by Mexicans and eaten with a big smile, and some other things like that, showing that you like American products, and something like that. And but that's really the more substance. Now, there's an important question about the relationship between social crises and economic crises. The deep economic downturn in 2008 has brought out into the open a social crisis in the United States. If you look, which is exemplified by the support for Trump. But I don't know if you've seen the work that came out by Ann Case and Angus Deaton on life expectancy in the United States, which among white males who are not college graduates has decreased dramatically, and particularly the increase in the death rate has to do with what we call diseases of despair, suicide, drug addiction, drug overdose, alcoholism. But now, for the United States as a whole, life expectancy for the country as a whole is on the decline. So this is remarkable for an advanced country. The only other time that I've seen anything like this was in Russia after the demise of the Soviet Union, where there was complete social disorder and a complete breakdown of society. And that's what we're seeing in the United States in the statistics on health. And so that's a symptom, but it's a symptom that reflects our data that we've had on income inequality and that I wrote about, for instance, in my book, The Price of Inequality. So we've been seeing this for years, but the crisis brought it out all into the open. So it is a social crisis. There are countries that have, over a period of years, succeeded in reducing inequality. I mentioned before, Brazil and Argentina have succeeded in reducing inequality from, admittedly, a very high level. So did Bolivia. There are countries like France that managed to stop an increase in inequality. So that's why I've said, yeah, inequality is basically a choice. It's a result not of underlying economic forces, it's a result of the policies that we put into place. And I'll be talking about that a little bit tomorrow. On the general question about debt, and if I understood it correctly, subnational debt, for a country like the United States, the overall level of national debt is not a significant problem. We can still borrow at negative real interest rates. So, you know, this fixation with the national debt is unjustified. After the end of World War II, the United States debt GDP ratio was 130%. And the period after World War II was our fastest period of economic growth. It was a period in which we had the most egalitarian growth. Every segment of our society grew, but the poorest grew faster than the richest. And it was because we weren't intimidated by our debt, but what we said is, we are going to go ahead and we're going to invest in our people and technology and infrastructure. And the result of that was we grew the economy and the debt GDP ratio went from 130% to 45%. So in my mind, that was the correct response. On the other hand, there are subnational units who can't borrow, you know, who can't print money like the federal government can. Now, this is just an aside. S&P 500, S&P downgraded the U.S. government. And I always thought that this is a real example of a rating agency either being politically using ratings as for a political agenda or both, being really stupid. And I'm not sure which, because the U.S. will never default on its debt. Because what is our debt at the federal level? It's a promise to pay U.S. dollars. And how do we pay U.S. dollars? We just print them. So, any of you worried, those dollars may not be worth much, but there is no risk of our not paying the debt. But at the subnational level, there is a problem. And we're seeing right now one of the worst cases of that in the context of America's largest colony, which should be a subject of outrage throughout Latin America. The fact that the U.S. still has colonies should be, in Latin America, should be the subject of an outrage. The colony is called Puerto Rico, and they have debts that they cannot repay, and the response of the federal government was to say, what little autonomy you have, you now have to give up, and we're going to give up the charade of self-governance, and we will have a control board, basically a receiver, that will approve all your budgets. And basically, you know, you talk about contraction. The government of Puerto Rico, in response to this, has proposed a budget that would result in a decline in GDP in 1 year of 16%, and which will devastate the people of Puerto Rico. So it is the worst case I have seen ever of austerity. So hopefully it won't happen, but that's what they are on the road to doing. So subnational debt does matter and is of concern, but it's a more complex question, particularly because it involves pensions and than I can talk about. Two other questions very quickly. The negative interest rates that some central banks have put are really interesting because, as I say, the zero lower bound, the issue was that mindset of the zero lower bound led some governments to say, oh, let's go through the zero boundary and have a negative interest rate? Well, you should know from what I've already said that I don't think moving from 0 to a negative interest rate is going, negative 1/2 or 3/4 or 1% is going to do any good. And the evidence so far is it hasn't done very much good. In some countries, it's actually had negative effects, it's had adverse effects. And again, the models that I described in my talk, I couldn't go into them, focusing on the banking sector would lead you to predict that unless you crafted those negative interest rates extraordinarily carefully. In the case, the reason for that is that if the banks have to pay interest rate, pay to keep deposits in the central bank, that has a negative effect on the balance sheet of banks. If the balance sheet of the banks get affected negatively, they're going to do less lending. And so the income effect of the worsening of the bank balance sheet is far greater than the substitution effect of the change of the interest rate. And that seems to be the case. So broadly, I think it's not a policy that will ever work. The final question of making things more automatic. The world, sort of the extreme case, again, I may talk about this tomorrow a little bit, of a world in which you don't need labor and there's just unemployment except for university professors. Besides that area, that being a little bit fictional, I'll tell a little story. 5 years ago at Davos, when we had discussions with Google and people, had a Google and about this, they said, back in the turn of the 20th century, when we created cars put out of job buggy whips and lots of other things, but it created more jobs than it destroyed. And the interesting thing is, in the discussions in the last 2 years with people, say the same, Silicon Valley techno-optimists, they've become techno-pessimists. They are not sure, they're becoming worried. They're becoming worried because, for instance, they say that within the largest employer of males who do not have, who have only a high school degree or less, is truck driving. Several million truck drivers. And there will be all trucks within 5 years, he predicted, Eric Schmidt predicted, would be driverless. So that occupation will be dead. And the question is, what will they do? And nobody is very sure. So part of the answer to that, in my mind, is there is a major societal problem. If society is, these innovations are making us as a society richer, then we have more resources, and we have more resources, we can, in principle, make everybody in our society better off. So it's a matter of distribution. And among the activities that we can do is create jobs. We can create meaningful jobs. We can create meaningful jobs, as we need important jobs. When I talk about the service sector, what are the important service sector? Education, caring for children, caring for the aged, healthcare. Why are those sectors so badly paid? Well, those are sectors that are basically not market-driven, but societal-driven. We decide how much we value the education of our children, or how much we value people taking care of their aged. So those are social values. And if we had different social values, those jobs would pay more, and if they paid more, there would be more respect. They would carry with them more respect. So in my mind, it is a challenge of how we are going to respond to these changes in technology, but it should be a blessing that we are becoming more productive. It's only a problem if our politics gets in the way and we say, well, all that productivity should go to a very few. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. And before I hand it over to Irving to close the keynote address and the ceremony, first of all, thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for answering all the questions in every detail, which leads us to one remaining question that left for tonight. Who's your representative young scholar? So, in YSI, and you already mentioned the importance of photo ops, in YSI, we value two things, amongst other things: people who read and people who ask questions. So I'd like to now ask everybody who asked the question to stand up, and everybody who has brought a book to be signed also to stand up. Everybody who asked the question, please stand up. Everybody who wants a book signed, please stand up. So now the question is, who is the youngest young scholar amongst this group? So who is 40 and younger?
40 and younger.
Okay, everybody who is 40 and younger, please remain standing. Who is 35 and younger? If you're 35 and younger, please remain standing. Who is 30 and younger? Please remain standing. Who is 27 and younger? Please remain standing. Who is 26 and younger? Please remain standing. Who's 25 and younger? Please remain standing. Who's 24 and younger? Please remain standing. Who's 23 and younger? Please remain standing. Who's 22 and younger? Please remain standing. Who's 21 and younger? Please remain standing. Who's 20 and younger? Please remain standing. Who's 19 and younger? Please remain standing. Oh, we have two candidates left. So, since we're about gender equality as well, I would like to ask both of you to come to the stage. We're going to have a selfie with everybody in the background. Please come up. Do you mind taking a selfie with them in the background?
Wait, wait. I don't understand how to do this selfie.
We're going to take a selfie with you and the two young scholars with everybody in the background.
Okay, fine.
So we have Emil, and what is your name?
Hi.
What's your name?
Miriam.
Okay, so maybe Irving, you want to join us?
Yes.
We'll take a big selfie, and all of you sort of wave in the background if you can. So I'll come over here.
Wait, I don't understand.
Okay.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right, congratulations.
Qué mejor postal que esta ya para despedir rápidamente. Muchísimas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Los esperamos, los invitamos aquí afuera, como diría Isidro, a continuar esta charla con un vino. Muchísimas gracias.
So I know you have to leave. There's a lot of people, like these 20 people have their books of yours.
Okay, they want to come up here or go somewhere else. Okay.
We can do it maybe outside. There's a reception outside. Maybe just do it.
Okay,
good. Set it to
quickly. Okay, set it to, yeah, do it quickly because I have to go and I have to make several calls.
Ah, sí. Es que los que van a